Cool. Thank you, Katerina. And thank you to the project for inviting me and for keeping inviting me back. It's always a pleasure to be in Amsterdam. So this paper is a development of some work I'm doing at the moment on this concept of myopia, which I'll explain shortly. I'm not going to be talking about misanthropy. My case study here is terrorism. And I think that's more than enough depression for one topic. There are two things I want to do in this talk. First, I want to make a positive claim. I want to suggest that our explanations of the nature, the origins, the functions, the attractions, and the persistence of extreme beliefs ought to be multidimensional, which is a term I'm borrowing from Quassim Cassam. A lot of my work here is based on Quassim, which is why he's here looking very unimpressed with me. So the positive claim is we ought to be multidimensionalists when it comes to extreme beliefs. The second claim, the negative one, is that unfortunately our explanations of the origins, functions, etc. of extreme beliefs tend to be myopic in extremely problematic ways. And at the end of the talk, I'll suggest a lot of this myopia, particularly about terrorism, tends to be motivated myopia. Got a copy of the handout here. You should have an account of all the arguments, references, etc. So start with multidimensionalism. This begins in three general claims, which are implicit in Cassim's work. I'm going to try to systematize them. So first, for extreme beliefs, there are always different kinds of explanation that we can use when we want to explain where the belief comes from, why the belief is attractive, why certain people adopt certain beliefs. There are always different kinds of explanation that you can use, and I'll give examples in a moment. And what you'll often see is that different kinds of explanations tend to be entrenched in certain disciplines or certain communities. So one reason that we should be multidimensionalists is because we should be multidisciplinary. Because, of course, extremist beliefs of whatever kind are extremely complex, and there's no reason to turn all the game over to just one discipline. Second, different kinds of explanation will be relevant or salient for different reasons in different kinds of cases. And again, academics will often like to argue over whether their kind of explanation should be privileged, whether their kind of explanation is relevant. But given the immense heterogeneity of extremist beliefs and the different contexts under which people acquire extreme beliefs, the relevance and the significance of these different kinds of explanations will vary, often on a case-by-case-by-case, context-by-context basis. Third general claim is that complex phenomena will typically require multidimensional kinds of explanations. That's just a general claim, that in most cases, for most extreme beliefs, regardless of the context or the particular belief in question, we will need to be multidimensionalists. So this is functioning as a general normative epistemic claim. In almost all cases, for almost all kinds of extreme beliefs, we ought to be multidimensionalists. People who are able and disposed to employ a range of different explanatory styles to try to understand the origins, nature, etc. of those beliefs. Now that is a very general normative claim. Now, what are these kinds of explanation then? Now, I'm not going to give an exhaustive account. Quassim mentions 5, I'm going to mention a 6, but this is just intended to be indicative. So here are 6 very, very general kinds of explanation that you could use for extremist beliefs. First, there are cognitive psychological explanations. You try to explain why people come to hold certain beliefs by reference to certain features of an individual agent's psychology, their cognitive biases, reasoning habits, inferential styles, their ways of thinking. You explain in terms of individual level psychology. Or second, there are character explanations. So maybe you try to explain why people adopt extreme beliefs by reference to features of their moral or epistemic character. You come to believe this because you're arrogant, you're dogmatic, you're epistemically insouciant, which is one of the vices Quassim describes. Or you might say that some people resist extremist beliefs because they are open-minded, self-reflective, intellectually humble. Here, this is still an individual level explanation, but in terms of the character, the epistemic virtues and vices of the agent. Or third, you might be a situationist. So maybe you think that in many cases you explain why people believe the things that they do by reference to certain situational features of the environment, the ways that certain claims are presented, the colours, textiles, and smells of a local environment, specific idiosyncratic features of the environment, which we know from some empirical work can have huge effects. So consider a trivial case of your beliefs about food. Now, I'm sure that the hotel last night, which I ate in, they know that if they serve me food on a round plate, and if the background lighting is of a certain brightness, etc., that will affect my beliefs about the quality of the food I'm paying a lot of money for. So you could appeal to situationist explanations. Fourth, you could appeal to what Cassim calls political ideological explanations. You try to explain why people come to hold the extremist beliefs that they do and how they hold them by reference to features of their political or ideological convictions. Maybe, for example, their entrenched fear of the state, or their profound belief in individual liberty, or whatever the particular features of their political ideological outlook might be. A fifth one, which I'll add to Cassim's list, are interpersonal explanations. Maybe in some cases you explain why someone comes to acquire extremist beliefs by reference to their interpersonal world, the people in their environment, how they relate to them, whether they are docile or servile or contentious or challenging, whether they just tend to be a follower or whether they tend to push back. You might reference the diversity of views and outlooks within their surrounding epistemic environment. Do they have a very homogeneous social circle? Do they just engage with people like them? Do they have friendships across class lines and colour lines and culture lines? Or is everyone in their interpersonal world just like them? So maybe you want to explain things in terms of their interpersonal world. Or maybe, to take a final one, you explain why people hold extreme beliefs in socio-structural terms. Maybe you believe that the main reasons people acquire extremist beliefs is because, for example, they live in a society dominated by epistemic bubbles, or by fake news, or by circulating systems of misinformation, or because they live in a highly hierarchical society, etc., etc., etc. So these are just 6 very, very generally described kinds of explanation. And I take it they are genuinely distinct kinds of explanation. One reason that they're distinct is that they explain in terms of different kinds of factors: cognitive, characterological, virtues and vices, environmental situational features, political ideological aspects, etc., etc., etc. So when I talk about a multidimensionalist using different kinds of explanation, here's at least 6 general kinds of explanation that they might be using in any certain case. A few caveats on this. First, obviously there can be other kinds of explanation. These are just 6 very, very generally sketched. We can give much more specific versions of each of these, and we could probably describe other kinds of explanations as well. Evolutionary, historical, functional, adaptive, pragmatic, whatever. Second, we can also describe subvariants of all these different kinds of explanation. So maybe you like character explanations, and you think virtues and vices are where it's at. Although we've had good reasons not to think that virtues and vices aren't all we need. But then again, you could be a virtue reliabilist, or a vice responsibilist. You could be what Heather Battley calls a personalist about vices, etc., etc. So all of these kinds of explanation are internally diverse, and of course philosophers, sociologists, psychologists will have big arguments about which specific forms of these explanations that we ought to adopt. Finally, we should also know that these different kinds of explanation can relate to each other in very different ways. So maybe you're a sort of a genial pluralist, as William James says, and you welcome all of these kinds of explanation, and you think that they can all be cooperatively integrated with one another. So if you endorse the kind of virtue epistemology I've called critical character theory, you think that you can deploy character explanations and cognitive explanations and social situational explanations, etc., etc. You can plug them all together to produce a rich explanatory mosaic. Then again, not everybody thinks that. Many of these explanations might relate antagonistically. So if you're a situationist, maybe a disciple of John Doris, you don't want to have character explanations because you don't think there's anything called character. You don't think that there are cross-situationally stable character traits, in which case there can't be virtue, vice, and character explanations. So a situationist might want to scratch out character explanations. Or maybe you're a certain kind of structuralist, and you don't like individual level explanations. You don't want individual level cognitive and character situations. You think structures are where it's at. Maybe you want to go back to Levi-Strauss. Structures are all that there are. Or maybe you're someone who's maybe read Foucault in certain ways. It's structures all the way down. None of this individual level explanation stuff. So the kinds of explanation can relate cooperatively or antagonistically. So you don't have to use all of these styles, and you don't have to think that all of them will be relevant in every situation. But to be a multidimensionalist, you need at least 2 of them in play. So the question is how pluralistic you want to be. And that will depend upon your background, training, temperament, your exposure to different disciplines, your explanatory interests, etc. Which means then that we could cash out at least 4 general epistemic principles that are built into multidimensionalism. First one is that explanatory sufficiency, having a sufficiently good explanation, will typically require multiple kinds of explanation. If you don't buy into that, you're not going to be a multidimensionalist. So if you think that everything can be explained in terms of virtues and vices, you're not a multidimensionalist. You're ironically a dogmatic vice epistemologist, because all you will see is vices. Second principle, the relevance and the priority of these kinds of explanation will vary across cases. So maybe in a first case of extreme belief, you think, what do we need here? We need a bit of cognitive explanation, a bit of character explanation, some interpersonal explanations, but that's it. 3 is enough for this case. But maybe in the next case, it's all interpersonal, and you can explain all of it entirely satisfactorily just in terms of interpersonal cases. The relevance changes. Maybe in one case, what's dominant is a cognitive explanation of someone's extremism. But in the next case, you think, no, this is more socio-structural. The cognitive is there, but in this case, it's secondary. So you can keep switching around the priority. What kind of explanation is relevant here? What kind has priority? What has to be up front? Which one has to be put in the background? Which ones have to be put out of play? That's how the multidimensionalist thinks. It's a very, or it should be, a very adaptive, responsive epistemic stance. Also, we shouldn't prejudge the relevance and the priority of certain kinds of explanation. So imagine my dogmatic vice epistemologist. They think, no matter the case, you've got to have a vice explanation, or you're not really explaining. Now, that is, of course, dogmatic, because ahead of knowing the details of the case, you just couldn't really know. You might guess, or hope, or suppose that there's a role for a certain kind of explanation, but you must not prejudge in advance. It would be dogmatic always to presuppose that a certain kind of explanation must be at play. Again, you could wish or hope that it's going to be there. You might be quite thinking, oh, I hope my kind of explanation gets called today. But if it doesn't, then you should accept that. And a final principle, pluralism in one case needn't entail pluralism in another case. Maybe in one case of extremist beliefs, you need to employ all these kinds of explanation. You go super pluralist. Maybe in the next case, you just use one style of explanation. That would be fine. It's consistent, and it sounds odd for a multidimensionalist not to always have to be a pluralist. But you can be a multidimensionalist whilst only using one case, because all of these kinds of explanations are tools. And one important rule about tools is never use more tools than you have to. Just because you have a cool, shiny tool doesn't mean you have to use it. You only use as many tools as you need for the job that you're going to do. My dad was a mechanic. He taught me that a long time ago. Just because you have cool, clever tools doesn't mean you have to use them. And there is such a phenomenon as over-explaining. And a lot of epistemic problems are caused because people want to deploy clever tools, arguments, ideas, and distinctions when there just isn't a need for them. So those would be some of the general epistemic principles of multidimensionalism. And I'd hope that most people, looking at your face as you probably do, would endorse something like this picture, a sort of genial pluralism, because we're dealing with something extremely complex, which is extremist beliefs in all their variety, all the different ways that people hold them, all the different ways that people respond to those extreme beliefs. And of course, as a working presupposition, there'll be cognitive, characterological, historical, social, and ideological dimensions. The question is, which of these are salient in a given case? Now, of course, in practice, it's going to be much more complicated. It's really hard work to be a multidimensionalist. It's messy and it's complicated. You've got to learn different styles of explanation and master them and learn enough about the other styles of explanation that you can talk to people who use them. That's going to be extremely difficult. It's hard enough work to master one of these, but it is work worth doing. Partly because in many cases, different kinds of explanation will be necessary for different kinds of complexity. And also because you need different kinds of explanation based upon your explanatory needs. Maybe in one case, you want to ask the question, why did this person, maybe my college roommate, 5 years later, they become some sort of QAnon jerk? What happened to them? What went wrong? If that's a highly autobiographical, highly particular question about them, what happened to them, that might call for explanation in cognitive, character, and interpersonal terms. But suppose you ask a different question. Why do people become anti-Semitic? Why do people in general become like that? That's a very different kind of explanation. And maybe there you lean more towards socio-structural, historical, and other kinds of explanation. So that's a general sketch of the normative stance. That's multidimensionalism. And I'd hope that something like that would be acceptable to most of you. Rick's nodding. He's in charge of the project, so he's just consented for all of you. Okay. But now let's go on to the negative case. This is section 3, explanatory myopia. There's a general bit of methodology. I think you learn much more about cases when you look at failures and breakdowns and vices and when things go wrong. I think engineers call this error analysis. You build something, it goes wrong, you ask why. And the worry I have is that many of our efforts to explain the origins, nature, function, persistence of extreme beliefs tend to be myopic. Now, myopia, of course, is a visual metaphor. It belongs to the same family of metaphors as perspective, worldview, looking into something. And in its everyday sense, at least in English, if you're myopic, you have a problematically limited, constrained view of something. So imagine the owner of a business who's myopically fixated on profits and just doesn't see staff morale or environmental sustainability. They have a narrow, fixated view. When we criticize people for being blinkered, people who just can't see the big picture, what we're describing here is an epistemically myopic person. And I think that we can think about myopia here as having kind of two dimensions. First, you can be myopic because your outlook is too narrow. There's just a wider range of possibilities, themes, dimensions, perspectives that a person just cannot see or will not take seriously. When they look forwards, they only see the one thing or a limited range of things, but the wider dimension, the wider picture, eludes them. They either can't see it or they can only see these other things as inferior alternatives. So you can be myopic if your vision is just too narrow. You cannot see the broader, wider range of aspects, dimensions, etc. Or you could be myopic because your vision, your outlook is too shallow. There are kinds of depth that you just cannot discern, deeper levels of meaning, deeper kinds of significance, deeper historical narratives, deeper kinds of cause and structure that a person just can't see. So when we criticize someone for being superficial or trite or banal, we're criticizing them for failing to perceive certain kinds of depth. And I think that myopia is a general problem in human life. And people are very often prone to be myopic about things that they're negatively prejudiced against. Quick examples. Why do people use social security and welfare? Because they're lazy. Why do people become homeless? Because they're too stupid to manage their own affairs. Why are refugees coming to Britain? They want an easy life. These are all standard examples from British newspapers, sadly, of myopic explanations. Why do people become homeless? Why do they use social security? Why do they come to Britain as refugees? There's such a wide, deep range of causes, factors, and aspects here that those explanations are hopeless, but also, unfortunately, extremely popular. Now, one way to put this more formally, if you're myopic, then you are very limited in the range of explanatory possibility that you can experience, and you're also limited in your ways of responding to them. You're incapable of imagining certain explanatory possibilities, unable to take them seriously. You can only see them as secondary or trivial. Your epistemic imagination is hopelessly contracted and constrained, and so is your outlook on the world. And of course, the opposing epistemic values here will be breadth and depth. What the multidimensionalist wants is broad, deep understanding, or at least a broad enough and deep enough understanding of all the history, causes, and factors that are at work. They want a broad, wide, deep vision. I take it one function of education, generally, is to try to broaden and deepen people's minds. Here's one quick example of explanatory myopia about extremism, and this is the case of conspiracy theories. So if you follow the literature, you'll know that one of the big arguments is what kinds of explanations should we give for conspiracism? Some people prefer exclusively psychological explanations. You explain conspiratorial production and consumption in terms of individual level psychological tendencies, a tendency to over-attribute agency where there ain't no agency, or a preference for certain kinds of narratives. Now, I take it there's obvious psychological dimensions to a lot of conspiracism, but for other conspiracy theory theorists, there's just much more going on than that. And if you only see the psychological dimensions, you're really not seeing all the complexity of conspiracy theories. So for Quassim and many others, many conspiracy theories have political functions. They express political values like suspicion of the state. They are intended to communicate certain political views to others, like don't trust the Jews, or whatever the content might be. And their claim is that if you only look at these psychological dimensions of conspiracy theories, you really don't have a broad or deep enough view of what's going on here. There are broader, deeper causes to conspiracy theories, including long historical narratives. So a claim Quassim makes is that historically, most conspiracy theories began in anti-Semitic theories. And of course, over time, they've developed. And so if you're only thinking about conspiracy theories psychologically, you're being myopic. There are broader, deeper possibilities that you're not engaging with. It might be a form of closed-mindedness. And for that reason, you won't be able to explain certain aspects of conspiracy theories. So there is the idea of conspiracy entrepreneurs, people who are not themselves disposed to conspiracism, but they're entrepreneurs, they're savvy. They recognize that by promoting conspiracy theories, they can advance certain of their interests, political, commercial, social, religious, or whatever. Now, in that case, it's going to be very difficult to explain the phenomena of conspiracy entrepreneurs purely in psychological terms, because those people themselves are not disposed to conspiracism, they're just using them as a tool, as a Trojan horse to promote some other kind of thing to you. And it should be clear that an explanatory myopia is an epistemic failing, or rather, it's a whole complex set of epistemic failings. The primary wrong of myopia is that it's epistemically bad, in lots of different ways. It can dispose you towards closed-mindedness and dogmatism. It's highly epistemically corrupting, in my jargon. It can occlude explanatory possibilities. It can distort your ability to recognize aspects of the cases in front of you. It can conceal certain aspects of the world that you really need to be able to see. It can make you under or overstate explanatory possibilities. For example, it might make you think, I have an exclusively sufficient explanation in psychological terms, because it never occurs to you that you could augment that psychological story with other factors. So in lots and lots and lots of different ways, explanatory myopia will be very bad for you. It will distort your overall epistemic endeavors, and it will prevent you from understanding things that you need to understand. For that reason, it will have secondary moral, political, and practical disadvantages as well. So it will be bad for your whole life, but the main harm, I think, is an epistemic harm. A couple of caveats on that. First, you might think, well, the obvious solution then is just a call for multidimensionalism. You know, if myopia makes you narrow and shallow in your outlook, great, let's just go broad and go deep. But that will be too quick, because there are bad faith calls for multidimensionalism. There are some cases where people urge us to take a broader, deeper view of things for invidious reasons. One good example is the doubt-mongering of big tobacco companies. What do they standardly call for whenever people ask about the connection between smoking and lung disease? We need more research. We need to consider other possible causes of lung disease, funguses, molds, spores, occupation, lifestyle, alcohol, environmental pollution. At one point in the 1970s, it was seriously proposed that sunspots could have a causal influence on people's lung health. Now, in that case, I think we have bad faith multidimensionalism. You have tobacco companies urging us to explore a wider range of explanatory possibilities and a deeper set of possibilities up to the cosmological level, not because they want to seek the truth, but as part of their strategy of permanent research without conclusion. More research, more research, more research. I think it was Philip Morris, the company, put it, doubt is our product. How do you generate doubt? By initiating endless, interminable epistemic inquiries, where the aim is not to come to truth, it's to never come to truth, by foreclosing the possibility of resolution. So some forms of multidimensionalism should be treated with suspicion. Second, there is a difference between explanatory myopia and explanatory monism. I said before that in some cases, it might be appropriate to use one kind of explanation. Maybe you think, I can explain this extreme belief purely in psychological terms. I've looked at the others, but I'm just using the one. That is a case of monism, not myopia, because you can make a reasoned case. And if someone said, really, just psychological explanations? You don't need to include any social, structural, political, ideological? If you can give a reasoned case for, no, actually, one is enough, that's fine. It might look from the outside like it's myopic, but the crucial difference is you can justify your choice of a single methodology. So monism and myopia are not the same thing. Also, we should importantly distinguish motivated myopia from what I'll vaguely call acquired myopia. So in many cases, people acquire their myopia. They, for example, might be trained by their disciplinary communities to be myopic. They're only taught one style of explanation. Or they go to a bad school where everyone's dogmatic for this kind of explanation. Maybe they're stuck in a department where people only do vice epistemology, or they only do situationism, and they're never exposed to anything else. People can acquire myopia from their educational and academic backgrounds, from their culture, from their environment. Many communities are defined by their myopic outlooks. So people can acquire myopia through no fault of their own. However, there are cases of motivated myopia, cases where people are myopic because at some level, consciously or not, they want to be myopic. They are invested in their myopia, or they're invested in the things that their myopia buys them, like a nice, clear, crisp vision of the world. And I'll talk more about motivated myopia later. We should also note that this sort of myopia will have many, many, many sources. You should give a multidimensional explanation of myopia, which ironically is a very complex phenomenon. It might be certain cognitive features of human beings. It might be deficiencies in your epistemic socialization, exposure to people who dogmatize or propagandize for one kind of explanation. Lots of things feed into myopia at the individual, collective levels, which is going to make questions of responsibility really, really, really difficult. We should also note as well that it's not just individual people who can be myopic. An individual can be myopic, of course, but collectives can be myopia. You might be part of a community because you share their myopic outlook. Maybe you live in a xenophobic community. But also institutions can also be myopic. Institutions, governments, policies, intelligence agencies, all of these could be myopic. In fact, in organization studies, there is a concept of organizational myopia, which describe the ways that certain kinds of myopia get inscribed into an institution, into its norms, procedures, sources of evidence, etc. So lots of things can be myopic. It's not just individuals. It could be individuals, groups, collectives, institutions, maybe even cultures as a whole. That would be a very big claim. Okay, so that was all very abstract. That was a general sketch of the ideal of multidimensionalism, but also of this problem of myopia, the tendency that many people and many groups feel towards problematically constrained, narrow, shallow, explanatory outlooks. And the example I'm going to give now to make this all much more concrete, hopefully, is terrorism, and in particular the epistemology of terrorism and of counterterrorism. So this is section 4. And here again, I should say my work here is very much inspired by Quassim Cassam, one of the very few philosophers to take terrorism and terrorism studies seriously. There's not a huge amount of work on terrorism by philosophers compared to other disciplines, and it's very peculiar, as Quassim says, that philosophers are so late to the game. So this is partly an attempt to show that philosophers do have something useful to contribute to terrorism and counterterrorism studies. And what I want to do here is take you through just 2 models of the etiology of terrorism, of the origins and causes of terrorist beliefs, and try to show that they're myopic. And the worry here is that many of the most influential and most popular models of the etiology, the origins of terrorism, especially those enacted in government policies, tend to be myopic, and I'll suggest they're probably cases of motivated myopia. I think this is not a case of accidental, inadvertent, oops, we didn't realize myopia. I think this is strongly politically motivated myopia. We have myopic models of terrorism because at least some of our leaders and certain intelligence agencies and some of the corporate interests behind them want us to have conveniently myopic models. I should also say that I'm not the first person to make a charge of myopia here. So Anthony Cody, the Australian philosopher, he has a very good book called The Meaning of Terrorism, and he's complained about forms of moral, intellectual and political myopia that he thinks are distorting terrorism studies. But I don't think Cody is using myopia here in the technical sense that I am, but I think that what I say is consistent with what he says. I should also note, before I give the examples, that you could be myopic about lots of different things when it comes to terrorism. I'm going to focus on the etiology of terrorist beliefs, questions of how and why do people acquire terrorist beliefs? How does one become a terrorist? How does one acquire those ways of thinking? That's the etiology of terrorism. But you could also be myopic about your definition of a terrorist, about the social identities of terrorists. If you ask the question, well, who can be a terrorist? Well, in many cases, the question tends to be very myopically answered. So Cody notes that the Islamophobic stereotype, who becomes terrorists? Muslims become terrorists. Or more broadly, Arabs become terrorists. That is obviously a myopic definition of who counts as and who can be or who is likely to be a terrorist. Or you can have a very myopic definition of what counts as terrorism. So a really, really, really big question in terrorism studies is, obviously, what is terrorism? How do you define it? For example, must there be a reference to political objectives? Most people agree yes. But what about the deliberate targeting of civilians or innocents? There is a big debate about this because, of course, the wider your definition is, the more people and movements and things count as terrorism. And again, this is going to be a very important question, not just conceptually, but politically and legally. So a few years ago, you might remember a small group of armed white militia occupied the Malheur Nature Reserve, I think in Alaska, and there was a big debate about whether this is terrorism. And unfortunately, a lot of the debate was, it can't be terrorism because these were white people. Now, in that case, well, look, political objectives, attacking a federal site with weapons, threatening violence, like, surely that's a lot of the definition of terrorism. But with this background implicit conception of the identities of terrorists, it didn't quite work. In fact, one commentator said, it would have really helped us if they had actually killed some civilians, because then it would be easier to persuade people that they were terrorists, which is a bizarre thing to say. So you could be myopic about lots of different aspects of terrorism. What counts as a terrorist action, who is or can be a terrorist, or, my focus, how one becomes a terrorist, in the sense of how one acquires the terroristic beliefs that can lead one into terrorist behaviours. And I'm going to discuss just two models. The first is called the rational agent model. The second is the radicalisation model. I'll give you a general sketch of each and then explain the ways in which or at least some of the ways that I think that they can be myopic, and then I'll finish with a point about cynicism. So the rational agent model, the basic idea here is that terrorism should be understood as the work of rational agents, agents who have objectives, goals, and who rationally identify strategic measures that would help bring about those ends. So the idea is that terrorists, as much as one might dislike them, should be understood as rational strategic thinkers, or at the least, they're no more and no less rational and strategic in their thinking than any number of other agents, governments, private corporations, etc. Now, the rational agent model was, interestingly, originally introduced to try to encourage the idea that we can understand and make sense of terrorists. Originally, it had, in a certain sense, good motivations. Before that, there was a strange sense that you can't really make sense of these people, you can't understand them. But it was quickly pointed out by looking at certain examples, well, actually, I can understand why they would think that doing that would lead to that result. So one of the very discussed examples was the IRA. So, well, look, it's clear what their political motivations are, and I can see how doing those things could lead to the fulfillment of those sorts of objectives. So initially, actually, it was an attempt to try to encourage a richer epistemic engagement with terrorism. Unfortunately, over time, the rational agent model has become less popular. Some of the reasons are due to its myopia, but some of the reasons are more general. First is that it became very difficult to generalize this as an account of terrorism, because in many cases, it's very difficult to fairly describe many terrorist movements as rational, even on a very broad sense of this. As Thomas Nagel said, it is excessively charitable to try to interpret many terrorist movements as exemplars of rational strategic thinking. There are, if you like, efficient, skilled terrorist organizations who are, strange as it might sound, are better at doing terrorism, and there are incompetent, fumbling terrorist groups who in a certain sense don't know what they're doing. But it became very difficult to generalize this to all terrorist groups. Another problem is that if you take the idea that terrorist action should be seen as rational and strategic, in many cases the objection is, well, but clearly they were ineffectual. You know, if you really were a rational agent, you wouldn't have done that, you would have done this. You wouldn't adopt those behaviors, you'd adopt these behaviors, because those aren't going to work for fairly obvious reasons, whereas these ones might. And in other cases, terrorist behaviors are clearly self-destructive. So one point that people made is that if the aim of Al-Qaeda really was to try to get the US government out of the Middle East, then launching a major attack of the sort we saw in 9/11 is just an absurd thing to do, not just because of the loss of life, but because it was so easy to predict what the response of the US government would have been, especially during the administration of Bush #2. You could easily have predicted exactly what happened. A massive, destructive, sustained military campaign involving forceful interventions into a number of Middle Eastern and Central Asian countries, with the fundamental objective, as Bush said, of destroying Al-Qaeda. And in that case, the objection is, it's really not rational if by initiating this action, you precipitate a chain of events that will inevitably lead in your own destruction. And as other people pointed out, even if terrorists do have rational objectives and motivations, there are simply other methods, other means by which to go about trying to achieve those aims that don't involve uses of terrorist violence. And for these and other reasons, the rational agent model generally is now regarded with some skepticism. But what I would suggest here is that one, if you like, deeper problem of the rational agent model is that it's doubly myopic. First, it's narrow in the sense that it exclusively focuses upon rationality, as in many cases the sole exclusive motivating factor. It's about rational calculation. And this brings it to the second kind of myopia. It's not just narrowly rational, it's defined in terms of an even more narrow conception of instrumental rationality. So this is not just a narrow focus on rationality, it's a narrow sense of what rationality itself is. A very crude sort of like means-end calculation, which excludes a whole range of other factors, including political grievances, other kinds of rational thinking, moral considerations, religious considerations, etc. And for this reason, many critics say then, at least in the way that it developed over time, the rational agent model is clearly a case of motivated myopia. Because the question here is, well, what would be the attractions of such a weirdly, narrowly rationalistic conception of terrorism? Why would anyone go for this? Where you think it's just about rationality so narrowly defined. What would be the attraction, the function of that myopic construction of the etiology of terrorism? And I think here it's pretty easy to see why people would be motivated to pursue that kind of myopic model. First, it enables you to epistemically derogate or insult terrorists, because you can present them as narrowly rationalistic, as lacking a complex, rich inner life, as if their entire inner subjectivity is dominated by a very crude, very crass form of rationality. Why is that attractive? Well, because we like to derogate and think badly of our enemies and our others. And one way to do that is by presenting them as thinly rationalistic agents, lacking all those richer range of moral, social, and cultural capacities that make up a properly full human being. These people are kind of narrow, rationalistic monsters. And of course, that suits many people's purposes very nicely. Second, it discourages attempts at understanding and negotiation and empathy. Because, well, look, these people might be rational, but they're not rational in the full sense of being reasonable human beings. They're just entrapped within this narrowly means-end conception of rationality with these ugly motivations. But you can't reason with somebody like that. You can't discuss or negotiate. They're just means-end monsters with evil ends. There's no understanding of them. They're not reasonable in the very broad sense that we could have any rich epistemic relationship with them of the sort you would see in negotiation and discussion. And in that case, you get to a third attraction of this model. If these people are so narrowly and crudely rationalistic, and we can't negotiate with them, we can't understand them, we couldn't sit down around a table with them, so really, sadly, what's the only option we have left for responding to them and dealing with them? We're going to have to use violent measures. They won't sit down, discuss, negotiate, bargain, in which case the only option we have is to call in the armed forces. That's the only option we have left. And once you put these reasons together, you can clearly see why this model would be very attractive to many people. In fact, this sometimes converges in what's been called the new terrorism, a new construction of terrorism 10 to 15 years old, according to which terrorists are in fact completely unintelligible, at least to morally and rationally competent persons like ourselves. They can't be understood. Their aims and goals are unacceptable, morally appalling, limitless, prone to constant change. The idea then is that terror simply cannot be understood. They are, quote, divorced from rational thought. They have an altogether different logic, a logic so different from the logic of you and me and other civilized people that there can be no communication, no discussion, no understanding, no empathy. They are aliens to us in a very real sense. Hence, the only way we can deal with them is by doing things that would be brutal if we did it to other reasonable, rational persons, like violence, warfare, and bombing, but there is no other option in this case. And for some of the critics of the rational agency model, this partly explains a lot of counter-terrorist policy of the last few years. For example, Richard Jackson says, the myopia of the rational agent model explains why so little effort has been made by terrorism experts to try and understand terrorists by listening to, in their own words and messages, and seriously engaging with their subjectivity. Because to do that, you'd have to acknowledge that they had subjectivity in the sense of a rich, complex, morally, epistemically detailed inner life. So how do you avoid engaging with their subjectivity, listening to their testimonies, taking seriously their grievances? Just construct them as narrowly rationalistic creatures with an altogether different logic, totally preclude the possibility of any understanding in any discussion, step back, and then let the army step in. So that would be then a clear case of motivated myopia. Second model is the radicalisation model. Now this one has become much more popular probably over the last 20 or so years. It's very popular in the UK. In fact, the radicalisation model is now part of UK government policy. When I organise workshops in Nottingham, there's a little section where I have to indicate that my conference conforms to the prevent policy, which I'll explain in a moment. And the core idea of the radicalisation model is that if you want to understand why people become terrorists, what you have to understand is that some people are peculiarly vulnerable or susceptible to being radicalised, cognitively in terms of their beliefs and thinking, but also behaviourally in terms of how they will then act. The problem is that some people are very vulnerable to radicalisation, and if you expose them to extremist material, you will radicalise them. And if they are not successfully de-radicalised, or in other ways stopped from acting, then they will become terrorists, sometimes called the contagion model. Some people are vulnerable to infection by extremist ideas, and if they get exposed to those extremist ideas, they will become infected, and then they will become violent terroristic people. So that's the basis of the UK Prevent strategy, which is primarily used as a device to intervene into Muslim communities. Because as we'll see, one of the claims is that for some peculiar reason that no one can identify, Muslims are peculiarly vulnerable to radicalisation. And so we have to be very careful about controlling the spread of extremist material, which involves monitoring mosques, Islamic communities, online chat forums, the content of university and school education, which is why it's mentioned in the risk assessment for Nottingham University conferences. You have to protect these people in a very positive way. You have to protect these people from exposure to extremist materials that they lack the ability to recognise and respond to. Because if they get infected, the result will be increased terroristic behaviours. Now, the radicalisation model has been popular, at least to the UK government, or UK governments over the last 20 or so years, for at least two reasons. First, it claims predictive power, which is, of course, something that you would want if you're going to develop policy. If you can identify which people are vulnerable to radicalisation, you can predict which people will become terrorists unless the state intervenes. Secondly, it also points to a very obvious policy solution, which is de-radicalisation. So as Quassim Cassam says, if radicalisation is the problem, then the solution with respect to the not yet radicalised Muslims is to prevent their radicalisation by keeping certain materials out of their communities or intervening into their communities to try to control their local epistemic environments, to keep out extremist material of any kind, limiting internet access, controlling school curricula, whatever it might be. And again, there are lots of probably very obvious problems with the radicalisation model. One of them is that there is this extremely obscure idea of vulnerability to radicalisation, which is absolutely central to the model, but which is almost entirely opaque. I mean, what does that mean, vulnerable to radicalisation? Do you mean disposed to extremist behaviours, and therefore maybe to beliefs that will support them? Or do you mean vulnerable to taking on extreme beliefs? Or do you mean that certain people lack certain kinds of self-awareness or critical abilities? Or what? There are so many different psychological possibilities for what vulnerability might be that would need to be resolved, but it's left strangely empty. But here, I just want to focus on what I think are three interrelated kinds of myopia built into the radicalisation model. So first, it presupposes a single path to radicalisation. They use the definite article, the path to radicalisation. So there is one etiology of extremist terrorist beliefs. You get radicalised. That's how you acquire these beliefs. The problem is that's simply empirically false. There are so many different ways that people acquire these beliefs, so many different ways of internalizing these beliefs into their lives, so many different sources and factors feeding into terroristic ideation. And again, this point is made by many terrorism scholars. So Quassim speaks of, for example, multiple, highly personal, idiosyncratic pathways to behavioral radicalization. Heath Kelly speaks of highly individualized, often disconnected pathways of citizens into armed militancy. It's so obvious that terrorist beliefs have complex etiology, many sources, many factors, psychological, historical, moral, political, religious or pseudo-religious, etc. But all of that breadth just gets compressed into one thing called the path to radicalization in an appallingly narrow way. Second, the radicalization model is also narrow in another sense. It has a very narrow explanatory focus, because when you ask the question, who might become terroristic, who might acquire terrorist beliefs, the explanatory spotlight is only going to illuminate Muslims, or those who are more broadly perceived as Arabs or as Middle Eastern. But the explanatory spotlight doesn't go broader. It doesn't look at a range of moral, social, and religious groups. It is a spotlight designed only to illuminate one social group. in a way that so clearly reflects Islamophobic prejudices. It is not a spotlight designed to see what's out there. It's a spotlight designed to target certain specific groups. So it has a very narrow explanatory focus and a highly targeted one. Third, maybe slightly more interestingly, the radicalization model also has a shallow conception of agency, a conception of human agency that lacks relevant kinds of depth. So the idea seems to be that these people who are vulnerable to radicalization, they're people who just get radicalized. If they're exposed to extremist material, it's like someone with no immune system. They will just get infected straight away. But of course, this constructs radicalizees as essentially passive. People who have no deeper cognitive or epistemic or moral capacities, people who can't think, deliberate or reason, people who lack the deeper capacities to recognize extremist material, people who lack the existential capacity to self-monitor their structure of attitudes, beliefs, emotions and behaviors and recognize long-term changes in the overall structure that might invite moral disquiet. All of those deeper human capacities are removed, and these people are presented as essentially passive receptacles, almost like a blank piece of paper. If you impress these extremist beliefs onto us, we'll just take them on. And of course, that itself is extremely shallow, and it's a shallow construction of human beings, and shallow constructions of human beings are always dehumanizing, and not just for the Kantian reason that you deny people the respect owed to rational agents. And this shallow conception of agency also generates other problems. For example, it just can't cope with certain kinds of well-established cases of terrorist etiology. For example, there are many well-documented cases of people who actively self-radicalize, people who are not passive recipients of extremist beliefs that they just can't cope with, people who themselves undertake conscious, deliberate action to radicalize themselves by seeking out people that they know are extremist, by seeking out materials that they know are extremist, people who carefully structure their interpersonal worlds to ensure their radicalization. That would seem to be impossible on the dominant forms of the radicalization model, and yet they're very well established. Second problem, the radicalization model doesn't accommodate people who have really strange, highly particular, idiosyncratic pathways into terrorist beliefs. You know, people who just don't fit the radicalization model. There are people who have become terrorists not through any exposure to radical material at all. They take these really strange, almost backdoor routes into certain kinds of terrorist belief without any exposure to these extremist materials at all. And again, the model can't really accommodate them because of its fixation on this single, narrow, etiological path. If you're vulnerable to radicalization, you're exposed to extremist material, boom, it happens. Quite regardless of your inner life, because, by the way, you don't have an inner life. You don't have any inner moral or epistemic resources that could help you to protect this. So here we have three interlocking kinds of myopia, forms of narrowness and shallowness that, again, arguably, are deliberately built into the model. In fact, we know that they're built into the model because we have first-person accounts of what happened when the government said to the intelligence and security agencies in the UK, we want a model of terrorism, we want a single pathway, because that's simpler, and we want it to point to definite policy solutions. So the intelligence agencies were tasked with producing a myopic model. We want a single pathway into radicalization, and we want a single counter-radicalization strategy. So in a sense, the intelligence agencies produced the model they were asked to provide. They produced a myopic, problematically monistic model. And this actually fits in with a thesis offered by Lisa Stampnitsky, where she complains about certain problematic developments in terrorism and counter-terrorism after 9/11, where the idea seems to be that after 9/11, actually, there was a marked tendency towards certain kinds of bad conduct within the terrorism studies community, in particular a fondness, a taste for certain kinds of myopic model. And Stampnitsky calls this a politics of anti-knowledge. He says an active refusal of explanation. Now, that might be too strong. I think what we really have is a kind of collective institutionalized myopia. It's not a resistance to explanation, period. It's a resistance to certain kinds of broader, deeper, multidimensional explanations of the nature, etiology, and attractions of terrorism. So this politics of anti-knowledge, then, is a form of systematized myopia, which unfortunately has now been built into many government policies. Okay. I've already run over, so I'm not going to talk about cynicism, except to make the one point that we should generally be very, very cynical when it comes to models of extremist belief and behavior, because I think that human beings are very, very strongly disposed to offer myopic constructions of any behaviors and any beliefs that they see as extremist. or, well, any that are extremist, or any that they want to see as extremist. Whenever you're confronted with someone or something that you see as extremist, your motivation is to construct myopic models. Crude, facile, simple, but for that reason, very, very attractive models. Whether the extremism is anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, terrorism, criticisms of lockdowns, environmental pessimism, our default response to those we want to see as extremists is to construct self-justifying, self-legitimating myopic models. And that's a gloomy note to end on, but that's where I'm going to end. Thanks for listening.